The ceasefire between Israel and the terror group Hamas is officially over. These are images of bodies being pulled from the rubble overnight after airstrikes carried out by the Israeli military. As the country confirms, it has sent ground troops back into the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Health Ministry, which is controlled by Hamas, says that hundreds of Palestinians have been killed. The renewed military operations come as Israel is demanding the release of all remaining Israeli hostages still being held by the terror group, including an Israeli-American, Adnan Alexander, who grew up in New Jersey. It's been almost a year and a half since Hamas's horrific October 7th, 2023 attack on Israel that left 1,200 Israelis dead and some 250 more taken hostage, men, women, and children, elderly and babies. So what happens next, and how should concerned Americans feel about the prospects for peace? We are joined this morning by Anat Sulton-Dadon, the Consul General of Israel to the United States, the Southeastern U.S. She's Israel's top diplomat here in the region, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. What should concerned Americans know about these latest military operations that have been taking place over the last several days? What happened to the ceasefire?
Well, unfortunately, U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff actually put two proposals on the table in order to extend the ceasefire, which Israel accepted. Hamas rejected, and they are not negotiating. The hostages are still there, and they have been using this time in order to regroup and prepare to continuing to attack Israel. And unfortunately, we have to act. We have to act in order to ensure that we see all of the hostages return home and that we see that Hamas no longer be able to attack Israel.
We saw some of the images. We showed them just a moment ago, and we hear the death toll announced. Again, this is by Hamas, so you have to scrutinize these numbers, take them with a grain of salt, because they're coming from a terrorist organization that benefits propaganda-wise from civilians being killed. But that said, we can see the damage, we can see the destruction and the devastation. Israel, of course, has its critics. What do you say to them, those who say that Israel has gone too far?
I would say that war is a horrific reality, which is why Israel has never chosen war. And to all those concerned about the suffering of the Palestinians who are indeed suffering, where is their concern and where has their concern been? For a year and a half now, they could have called on Hamas to release all of the hostages and lay down their weapons. The war would have been long over. The war could be over today if they demanded of Hamas to release the hostages and lay down their weapons. That's all it will take. Where is that concern for the Palestinians when they are pointing the finger at Israel rather than pointing the finger at the terror organization that is not only dedicated to the destruction of Israel still, but has no care for their own people and does nothing to invest in building a future for their people? They are investing everything in the destruction of their neighbor.
What do we know about Hamas and support for that organization amongst Palestinian civilians who are suffering so much as a result of the decisions made by the people that rule Gaza? What do we know about support for Hamas, again, among just Palestinian civilians?
We all saw the images coming out of Gaza on October 7th. Following October 7th, we've heard testimonies from hostages who have been released from captivity, and we know that unfortunately there are many Palestinian civilians who have been indoctrinated by years under the rule of this terror organization that has been indoctrinating their own children from a young age, being taught to hate rather than being taught to build a future. And the result of that is that they are also the victims of this oppressive terror regime. The change can only come when the Palestinians have a leadership that finally looks to their people in order to build a future for their people, instead of a leadership that is committed to the destruction of Israel.
So President Trump has certainly shown major strong support for Israel. But he has also posted some videos on social media showing the Gaza Strip with a Trump hotel, turning it into some kind of a resort. Is that the future of Gaza, or is there any way at this point to have a two-state solution with two different countries, a Palestinian country and a Jewish country side by side?
I cannot paint what the future for Gaza looks like, but I can say that it can be a beautiful future, and it should have been a beautiful present. It could have been. The choice by their leadership was different. And if one wants to look at a different future and see a future of hope for the Palestinians, for the Israelis, it will take a courageous leadership on behalf of the Palestinians, but also in the international community, because it is time that the international community start holding accountable Palestinian leadership, which instead of being dedicated to hatred and to destroying Israel, should be dedicated to building a future for the Palestinian people.
Anat Sulton-Dadon is the Consul General of Israel for the Southeastern United States. She is based here in Atlanta, and we thank you for coming in this morning.